And when they pull together, as they're doing at the present moment, the pull is added, you see, and we get high tide.
Granted that the forces are enormous, just how big are they?
From Patrick Moore frolicking around in the sea in his suit in the 1960s episode of The Sky at Night,
The biggest natural force in the entire world.
to David Attenborough's dulcet tones lulling us into a microcosm of curious creatures.
A series of such differences might add up to one revolutionary change.
We've come a long way since television's first voyage into the great unknown world of science and the scientist. Now even the chiselled features of a 90s pop star confront the science shows that transfix British viewers by offering up the secrets of our universe.
I think as a tool to hook someone on a subject like natural history, like snakes, like underwater, like bird watching, things like that. If you want to hook someone, television is brilliant.
David Attenborough's inspired a hell of a lot of people. Carl Sagan inspired a hell of a lot of people, and Brian Cox is doing it now, and I think that's great.
And to see just how far it's come, we delve into the world of science on current British television, from the reputable real science programmes of the BBC to the more outlandish entertainment of Channel 4. What types of science programming ends up on our telly? How does the science box shape our vision of science today? Does it, in fact, provide a distorted view of what science actually is? We're exposed to science every day, but where do we get our information about how stuff works? Whilst our classroom days of biology, chemistry, physics and maths may have taught us how to grow cress, draw a graph, or even singe off our eyebrows with a Bunsen burner, for those of us less inclined to become the next Einstein or Feynman, television remains a powerful influence over our understanding of the scientific world.
And that's what science does. Science gives you understanding, and understanding not only gives you, as it were, power, but it also gives you a heck of a lot of fun.
A lot of people who make natural history films were inspired by something, and for me it was television. I mean, for me it was Attenborough. It was a film called Blue Water, White Death I saw about great white sharks 25, 30 odd years ago. So that, I mean, no greater example, I guess. The only reason I'm sat here is because I watch natural history television programmes.
I think it's important to communicate science because, first of all, it's enjoyable for the people who receive the information, enjoyable for people who are giving the information. I think it does have a broader educational role, and everybody should know what we spend our money on, such as, finding subatomic particles or whatever. Somebody's got to do that communication. But also I think that it picks up and gives a visual dimension to where schools leave off. At the end of the day, schools are blackboards and textbooks, and television goes beyond that. And so if you're seeing a volcano explode, it's a visual experience, and you learn a lot from that visual experience, rather than just sort of learning a diagram in a book.
Most people have a television. Not everyone lives in Kenya, not everyone lives on the bank of a river, but most people have a television.
This is the worst scientific scandal of our generation. Here, the Daily Express. Now there are lies, damned lies, and global warming.
Although newspapers, radio and the internet also play their part, few have studied the extent of science in the media, and even less researchers consider the role television has to play, since Roger Silverstone accompanied Horizon to reveal how a science documentary is made. Once upon a time, science was easy to spot. Symptoms included a brown suit, comb over and manic stare. But as film exploded into a cacophony of colour, graphics and charismatic presenters, it's become a little harder to identify.
What is science? ? Well, William Blake said, art is the tree of life and science is the tree of death. And I'm very fond of William Blake, so I kind of agree with him there to an extent. Science is the objective study of the world around us, and it goes a long way, a lot further than people think, but a lot less far than other people think. It has nothing to do with morals, for example, nothing to do with politics, except in the practical sense. So I often say, and I said that on the radio not long ago, that science is the ideal field for somebody who's mediocre, like me. Because anything you do in science will add something to the mountain of information that we have. And that isn't true, of course, for writing novels or poetry or music. Most of it disappears without trace, is never ever seen again. So science, that's the great attraction of science, which is any fool can do it. And that's useful really to the television and radio audience, because it also means that any fool can watch it.
I think what tends to be classed as science are the traditional sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. The sort of thing that you could plausibly have been taught in science lessons at school. And it's largely about knowledge. It's about things that we know or have discovered. What I actually think is a better way of thinking about science is, well, Carl Sagan used to say science is more than a body of knowledge, it's a way of thinking. It's an approach to discovering that knowledge rather than just the knowledge itself.
Well, I think weather is one end of science where it's an experiential sort of force of nature, and you can explain a little or a lot about the weather, the science that's causing the weather, right down to sort of things about biology and physics where to understand the topic you have to understand the science. But there's a huge range of things in between. A lot of shows have a little bit of psychology in them. In BBC Three we see a lot of shows which have a psychologist who's commenting, for example, on a child's behaviour. Now that may not feel like a science programme, but in fact it does have science in it, and the audience is taking away science information.
It is hopping, buzzing and plopping with wildlife.
To, you know, do what bees do to one another.
Watch out! Catch an episode of Springwatch or Embarrassing Bodies and you might accidentally learn something.
I think I've got excess sweating condition. They'll call me Sweaty Betty.
Something like Big Cat Diary, you'd watch a whole episode of that and learn an awful lot about ecology without ever hearing the word ecology or food chain. You know, and the presenters on that have a huge understanding of those big cats, and they would sort of get the science in by stealth, if you like. Programmes that are more obviously have a scientific content, like Great Barrier Reef, where we talked about coral coming from a coral polyp. It's definitely harder to do, but I don't think that should shy us away from it. And so many programmes here made by the NHU have got some really hard science into them. Springwatch is a good example, actually. There's, you know, in amongst the nice, you know, soft stories and people's stories or dramatic stories of animals, there's some really hard facts and science in there. And that's another way you can do it. You don't do it all the time, but when you do it, you make it count.
On a mission to find out how science is treated by British television, we looked at 3 weeks of terrestrial programming. And to ensure it was accurately represented, we defined science as not only the biological, life and physical sciences, but also the social and behavioural sciences and such applied fields as medicine, environmental science, technology and engineering. To find out if there are any patterns in the type of science shown on our screens, we've categorised science according to Professor Steve Jones's BBC report of science coverage, including life science, physical science, medical science, climate science and technology, mathematics, and then mixed, general and other. The rejects that aren't really at home in the other categories.
Here are the razors. I will try one. Just on the onion. Rather tasteless onion. No, not keen on that.
108 hours and 40 minutes of science was shown in this 3 weeks, making up an approximate 20% of all television programming. Nearly 50% of this was for kids. Deadly 60 is a regular feature on BBC One, capturing the imaginations of little would-be Livingstons across the UK.
That is just perfect. I've got him! I've got him! I can see his head. Just down there. Oh, look at that!
Steve Backshall is part of that. He's a fantastic role model, and role models are really important. And here's a guy who, he's all, you know, he looks big and tough and he's really outdoorsy, but actually he's very bright and he's genuinely interested in snails, or, I mean, great white sharks, of course, and lions and tigers. But he's as interested in a snail or a guppy or a chaffinch on his bird table. And I think kids really respond to that. I think on Deadly 60, we found a way to be really honest with the audience.
There was a wide mix of subjects, but as with the children's shows, life science, predominantly wildlife, dominated 44% of science programming, whilst medicine injected 10% of science to the schedule. The joker of the pack was the physical sciences, which have equalled medicine. Buoyed up by the good looks of Brian Cox, the physical sciences have returned to our screens with renewed vigour. Patrick Moore's Sky at Night is still broadcasting,
This is my new one. I can't resist it.
still popular, and the longest standing science programme on our screens.
Well, I'm afraid I haven't got any space rockets in my garden, but I have got a couple of big telescopes, and the largest of them...
But let's face it, Brian Cox has got a better bum, host of new graphics that really capture the visuals of our solar system.
I think that visualising the difficult to imagine sequences is part of television's role. So what goes on at a subatomic level, or atomic or molecular level, graphics come to the fore.
But whilst the BBC takes the lion's share of scientific discovery, providing 63% of coverage, and Channel 4 boasts a solid 24%, it was Channel 5 who punched above their weight, not only providing the remaining 12%, but nearly all of the engineering and technology programmes shown that week. ITV, on the other hand, produced none. Yep, no science whatsoever. So why is the box dominated by the life sciences? Do we, the British public, have too short an attention span for harder science? Or is it just easier to make a cheetah chasing an antelope, rather than a physicist chasing a God particle, which up until recently they weren't even sure existed, look good?
Wildlife lends itself to television because animals look amazing, and particularly with the lenses we have available, with the kinds of cameras, with the digital technology, slow-mo, time-lapse, we can show you things in ways that you've never seen them before. So television is increasingly good at that.
Now, of course, the BBC's images, particularly of natural history, are without question the best in the world. You just cannot beat them, largely because they spend fantastic amounts of money on it, largely because they've got an expertise that goes back for 50 years, and largely because the technology has become so extraordinary. For years I've been saying they couldn't make another better programme, but every time they do. But the irony is, and I went down to the Natural History Unit, and I was told there, sub rosa, that actually they had instructions not to put too much science in their programmes, which just strikes me as entirely stupid, because what they do is science. And David Attenborough, who I spoke to at some length, is very proud of the science that does get into his programme.
It's much harder to do stories about often relatively basic science, so fundamental lab science, in, say, an area such as genomics, which actually is a terribly exciting and very encouraging area of science, but is one that is actually quite hard to show on television because there's nothing to show.
Whilst this snapshot may not represent an entire year of British television, it does provide an idea of what channels are broadcasting and the ways in which they frame their topics.
You've got to remember that television has always been a mass medium. And it's never been, you know, we went through a phase of open university programmes and schools programmes, and a lot of that stuff is now done online. But I think with the general entertainment channels, if there's going to be science on them, the science has to be quite accessible. Otherwise it would not exist. And that would be worse.
It's very important to me that science content in the media, especially on TV, because of its tremendous reach, is fair and accurate and well presented. But I think it is important to remember too that I mean, broadcasters are businesses at the end of the day. Okay, maybe the BBC isn't a profit-making business in the same way that ITV is, and they have to be able to make a profit and to survive and produce things that people want to see. So I don't think anybody should think of science programming as in some way pure public service and nothing. It's not public service announcements as such. It's got to be entertaining and engaging, or it won't work and it won't reach an audience at all.
The ways in which stories are told add importance to subjects, letting us know the issues that matter and why.
It tells the public about what it's interested in, you know, and what's interesting about the public is that different bits of the public are interested in very different things. I mean, if you look at students, biology students here at UCL, many, not all, of whom are very good, almost all of them want to cure brain cancer, okay, and they're all very strongly biomedically oriented. If you go to somewhere like Aberystwyth, where I was the other week, almost all of them are interested in conservation. Okay, and so the audience is fractured and fractionated, and the BBC does pretty well at covering those fractionated audiences, but it doesn't do as well, I think, in trying to heal the fractures, you know, in trying to bring out a new and broader audience mix for any particular area of coverage. Journalists and the media are usually relatively low down on those trust scores, and but people do always say, oh, the people they really trust are their family and friends, and that's where they really get all their information and learn what to believe. Well, where do the family and friends get their information from? It comes from the media in the end, and therefore the output that you get, particularly through television, which remains, despite the digital revolution, easily the biggest audience of any medium of communication, it is ultimately through that that a lot of things reach the public, and therefore it really is rather important that performs well.
The way television funnels information influences our way of thinking. Tomorrow's World frame their stories with progress, a way of looking at the future through the benefits of science. Although many of these inventions didn't make it much further than the studio, or the bin. Others have a more moral tone, lecturing us on the pitfalls of eating badly or polluting our world.
With an 18-stone weight difference, these two are here to teach each other hard lessons in food and nutrition. By swapping diets, they will be shocked into facing their own body issues and hopefully change their relationship with food for good. It's time for Super Size to meet Super Skinny.
As we listen to presenters chatter away about theories,
the world of the unknown a little bit,
we're now a far cry from television's original lecture format.
Whether you've got too much skin, a problematic prolapse,
I can see them from here, I tell you that now,
or a gruesome growth.
They do look like a pair of testicles.
For many embarrassing bodies, surgery is the only answer. But having an operation does carry risks, and sometimes things can go wrong. And over the years, our doctors have seen it all.
Oh, I'm sorry if you're eating your dinner. There's a lot of pressure on television to maintain its audience, pushing it into the weird and wonderful in the name of science. These days, we get more than a presentation of the facts. It's how they explain the facts, their discourse, that counts.
My nipple looks like that red thing over there.
Not quite that colour now.
That is just seeping. I would imagine it gets quite smelly as well, does it?
It does, it gives off quite a nasty smell.
Has anyone mentioned the word fistula to you?
Not that they've ever mentioned, no.
Clearly there are connecting pathways in there, which may be the result of your original abscess, and you may have had tracts that have joined together that wouldn't normally be joined, which is what we commonly
Embarrassing Bodies takes television to a new level, some might say lower, and has been fiercely contested as to whether it really constitutes science.
Embarrassing Bodies? God, I mean, people watch it because it's shock value, don't they? I mean, I don't know whether you'd even class it as science telly.
Well, I think Embarrassing Bodies is a real triumph. It's absolutely packed with information. It does it in a very populist way, in a very shocking way, by showing various bits of the body in an unashamed way, in quite a graphic way. But actually, when you listen to the doctors, their analysis of it, they are giving probably as good as any GP will give you, and probably more because they know it's for the television, a description about the nerves or the fungus or the blood vessels or whatever it is, and they're going into, I think, a reasonable amount of science, sometimes a little bit of graphics, but often with a very good verbal explanation of what's going on. So I think Embarrassing Bodies is a triumph of entertainment and information.
At first glance, Embarrassing Bodies more of a medical freak show than a beneficial account of the nation's health. And yet it regularly averages 3 million viewers each show.
What happens when nipples turn nasty?
Is there a lot of gunky, oozy stuff?
The language, leaves little to the imagination. And if you want to be snobby about it, trivialises its scientific basis. But the doctors, called by their first names, there's no elitism here, talk like us. They normalise the medical procedure and alleviate viewer anxieties about seeking assistance and receiving diagnosis and treatment. No longer does Mr. Smith need to fear being prodded and poked by an overeducated toff using long words like secreting or infected, when oozy and rotten do just as well.
Do you guys ever examine it?
When I was about 16, yeah.
Why was it as a teenager and not now?
Something new as a teenager.
And what about the sort of texture, consistency?
Rice pudding.
Oh, God. All right, guys, we've all been Trojans and produced your samples for me there, so thank you very much for those. What do we think of them?
I don't know about Trojans. My Little Pony, perhaps.
It's easy to criticise something like Embarrassing Bodies for being about shock tactics, but we don't, natural history in it, we don't show you boring animals, or animals doing, you know, 90% of what animals do is trying to keep their head down. We show you the few percentage moments in their lives when they kill or be killed or they have sex. You know, so we're not exactly showing people the reality of an animal's life. We're showing them the best bits, and that's what Embarrassing Bodies is doing. You know, if people don't really have any medical problems apart from a bit of a cough, it's not great telly, is it?
There's a lot of discussion about whether programmes are dumbed down too much, and I think it's a bit of a sort of a false discussion, really. I think that what we have to remember, certainly in my career, the amount of science has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, multiplied hugely. There used to be pretty much Tomorrow's World and Horizon on the BBC with one or two specials. And now there's whole channels with huge amounts of science on Discovery Channel, National Geographic. Some of the programmes are quite science light, and there are those in sort of sometimes in academics, but just in the public, who think that they're too dumbed down and they want more. But I'm pretty much, for every example of that, there's one where people say, I really, found that quite educational. And I think it's very tricky to get the balance absolutely right. But there are so many programmes, there's always something at the right level for you.
Ooh! Here comes the science bit.
1% can contain more than 300 million swimmers. The remaining 99% contains many nutritious and protective chemicals that prevent the female immune system destroying the sperm when it enters the vagina.
It might be in bite-sized chunks, but it is there. Left to the voice of God, the anonymous narrator who is the trusted purveyor of truth, in lexical contrast to the doctor's "I'm one of you" chatter, medicine remains the hero. The GP is the common man's friend, the voice of God is the factual reference point for what's going on.
A vasectomy, or male sterilisation, is a procedure in which the tubes that carry sperm from the testes to the penis are cut and sealed with dissolvable stitches.
Patients are given control over their own bodies without any moral overtones, in a language they understand and pictures that glue our eyes to the screen.
Well, to me it's a bit 90s actually. Or noughties. I mean, I think it does a useful job. It's worth remembering that, when I was a student, say, longer ago than I'd like to admit, a woman with a lump in her breast would be embarrassed about it. And plenty of people will have died because they had symptoms they didn't want to talk about. Now, that was terrible. And that, I think, is now, thanks to the media, not just the BBC, but the media in general, people are now much more open about their bodies. If there are problems, they're happy to discuss them. My own feeling, which is rather an uncharitable one, is that recently Embarrassing Bodies has become a bit of a voyeur show. And it's difficult, really. I mean, there's a fine line to be walked.
It's like, is it a good story? Yes, it's a good story because it's about people that have humiliating conditions. I can't believe they're brave enough to go and wave their bits about on a 12-foot high monitor, but anyway, I wouldn't want to.
It's amazing that anyone would willingly submit to this on-screen spectacle, but it's the final account of patients, the active consumers, that bolster this credibility and triumph of medicine, and ultimately, science.
It's been 5 months since my operation, and my scar is healed up very nicely. In fact, I think they look gorgeous.
I think you've had a fantastic result, far exceeding any expectations I would have had, and I'm sure your really delighted.
It's the best I've felt in such a long time. I feel relieved and I feel like I've got my life back.
The show frames medicine as a solution. An ideology of medicalisation as an answer to all our ills, no matter how gruesome. And in case you missed it, the new lives of these patients are described as success, fantastic or great. Yes, the science is sparse, tenuous sometimes at best, but there is no doubt the medical process, one that's based on science, is fallible. Rather, medicine is our hero of health, wielded by the embarrassing body's GP fairy godmothers to reaffirm our trust in the Social Institute of Medicine.
So come on now to these rather sinister flying saucers, and I've no idea what they are, but there's only one way to find out.
If the sensational warts and all approach isn't for you, the BBC will provide you with unadulterated fact, pleasing images and cute and cuddly animals. This, the backbone of television science, would never resort to overdramatic visual imagery and melodramatic language that other channels employ to keep us engaged.
Give me the power to see things differently, the power to sell eternity, the power to save humanity.
Okay, so they do. But this is obviously science. There are professors and expert presenters and everything. This is proper science. But discourse plays the same role throughout television. It's a tool to keep the audience excited, engaged, and disinclined to switch over.
The media, whether it's television, radio, or print newspapers or websites, they're ultimately in the business of attracting eyeballs to their content. And there are multiple ways of doing that, but one of the obvious tried and tested ones is to be relatively sensational.
A one-off series from the BBC, Volcano Live delves into the most volatile places on Earth, as presenters Ian Stewart and Kate Humble get up close and personal with these natural phenomena. The finale of the series, shown here, coupled science and experiment with historical accounts of volcanic eruption. There's no disguising of the science as it's laced throughout, but the presenters are stood on the edge of a volcano as the didactic Kate Humble provides the introduction.
For 30 years, lava's been spewing out a line of craters engulfing homes and property. And in 2008, that crater exploded into action, forcing the closure of this park.
But does science know enough about volcanoes to keep us safe? This is Volcano Live.
And the ideology of science, the social authority and power of science as the guardian of truth, is unrepentant as viewers are enthused by sensational modal verbs will, is and are that underpin the authority of what they'll learn next.
Signs of activity. And one of the things they're looking at is the gas. In the weeks before the eruption of that, the Halemaumau crater, the gas levels just went through the roof.
Hyperbole, like embarrassing bodies, is rife.
Going through their mind. Their mountain, which hadn't even been recognised as a volcano, was exploding into life. A huge black cloud filled the sky and the ground was racked by earthquakes. It must have seemed like the end of the world was coming.
The deaths of those affected by volcanic eruption, labelled as victims, a word usually associated with crime or violence, are described in transparent detail as this natural phenomenon, a product of the course of nature, is demonised as a malicious animate being.
The real exact copy of the victims as they were found.
What's the story of these skeletons then? What happened to these people?
At the very beginning of the eruption, the town was shocked by several earthquakes. They thought these arcades could be a safe place, but actually this was not a good place to be for the eruption.
Sheltering here was no use, because the earthquakes and the huge ash cloud filling the sky was just the first phase of the eruption.
All programmes have a voice, and when you write the script you should have a voice in your head. So if you're writing with David Attenborough, you obviously understand how it's going to sound and the kind of language it might use, the same as Steve Backshall. I mean, every programme has a certain spin on it, and the spin with the volcano, clearly, totally deliberately, is that it's almost its own personality. and that it's a threat. But then if it didn't have a personality and it wasn't dangerous, it would be a program about a hill. So it's not, you know, I can see why they've done that. Equally, I think the audience should be reasonable and clever enough to know that that is the approach of that programme.
So much for the BBC not resorting to the Channel 4 depths of sensationalisation. But again, this type of language bridges a gap between a viewer's familiar experience and the unknown. After all, I don't think any of us have woken up to a lava lake running down our cul-de-sac.
Whether you're making a programme about medicine or physics or any kind of science or natural history or animals, whatever, it's about storytelling.
This personification of the volcano disrupts the show's dominant Enlightenment ideology that people can control nature, but it's quickly snapped back by the appearance of a scruffy on-site scientist in their natural habitat, solving the problem with over-lexical language, gobbledygook to you and I, as the presenter navigates the information in the ways of the common man.
You have been spending the last months and weeks actually mapping this lava lake using this extraordinary piece of kit. Can you just talk me through this, because I've never seen anything like it?
That's right. So this is actually what's called a ground-based LiDAR system, and basically what it is, it's a laser beam mapping system that allows us to do high precision terrain mapping at centimeter scale at long distances. So it's a unique operation that allows us, instead of just taking pictures, we actually can map in 3 dimensions different parts of the volcano.
The use of long words and unfamiliar names actually help us to trust what the scientist is talking about. The fact that the show is partially live, although disappointingly we don't get to see Stuart and Humble fleeing a river of lava as the crater there stood on explodes, does provide a spontaneity to the show that better represents real life, making us more likely to believe it. And we're even allowed to ask them questions. Well, you do if you're aged between 5 and 15.
First one from Alec, who's in Rhyl, and he is going to Vesuvius this October with his school, and he wonders, are there any laws on taking samples of volcanic rock from Vesuvius and back home to the UK?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are. I think there's many of these volcanoes that are protected sites, and I think you need to check, but I don't think you can. When I was there, I didn't take any because I was certainly worried.
Whilst they were never going to discover how to keep a lid on these giant, lava-spewing craters, science is directly pitched as the answer to the threat volcanic eruption poses to humanity, maintaining the dominant scientific ideology and framing the show as one of scientific progress.
For me, what the attention should be is taking the science that we've demonstrated this week, that we've got now, and applying it around the world to those places to save lives.
It's these choices of scientific fields and the frames and ideologies they present that influence scientific issues in the public agenda, whether we like it or not. And if it wasn't hard enough to navigate these nuances in language and hidden angles, how do we know they're even telling us the truth?
When you make a wildlife film, you spend 2 years researching it, say, and filming it, and of that time on a particular sequence, you might spend months in contact with a scientist, and then you spend several hours talking to them on the phone on 3 or 4 occasions, and you go and spend 4 weeks with them filming, and during that time you're with them, 12 hours a day filming, and you immerse yourself in this world of whatever they study, say for example some kind of snake behaviour, and then you film and you have a 3-minute sequence on the air, and actually that is that sequence you saw on the air of that groundbreaking behaviour is the pinnacle of masses of research within the BBC offices, masses of research and help from people unconnected with the BBC scientists, and they may have amassed 30, 40 years of experience, and there might be 3 or 4 of them. So you're seeing as a viewer the tip of an iceberg that is huge.
I've been in science programming for over 30 years, and the number of mistakes I've seen either from myself or programs I know about, or even competitors' programs, the number of mistakes are very small. I could almost count on the fingers of one hand.
All right, so you are then. You can't really blame television's progression from the 1950s stiff delivery to today's more vibrant scientific accounts. In such a technologically focused world, there's a lot to distract the viewer.
And of course, the thing which has changed dramatically in communication, and in science communication more than anything else, it's boring but true, is the internet.
the internet, essentially what we're talking about is digital media that can just spiderweb out from a particular point, and that's a brilliant thing because actually it stops control. I think the more control, the more layers of control you have between a product and its audience, I think the more potential pitfalls there are. So I think if the audience has access to all of this stuff, they make the choice of what they like, and the great stuff will be seen, and what isn't, won't. And I think that's a really good thing. I think we're at an age now where people, we're just on the cusp of people making films on their desktop and getting it out on the internet. Now that's been the preserve of the amateur filmmaker for the last few years, but I think that's going to meet the world of high budget filmmaking, natural history filmmaking. So I could imagine a time where people can make programs and get it out there without the controls of, it's nothing to do with the BBC, it's not even a channel, it's just whoever wants to watch it. And if it's good, people will watch it.
So science itself's being reinvented, repackaged and redistributed as technology improves and science becomes ever more spectacular and sensational. But if we look past all the sparkling images and eloquent presenters, there's a lot we have yet to discover.
Like the stone that brought Goliath to the ground, in the smallest atom is the power found, because nothing's impossible. Give me the power to see things differently, the power to sell eternity, the power to save humanity. Someday I hope to raise my hands and part the sea. Call me crazy, but I know it's meant to be, because nothing's impossible. Give me the power to see things differently, the power to sell eternity, the power to save humanity, the power to rule the galaxy.
That they gave us the power. Their contributions fail now with every passing hour. Time and space haven't changed, but our understanding has. The building blocks found in science and math. Since Edison and Tesla have battled for the grid, the A-bomb has come along and the nano druid. The moon has been walked on and Mars is next, cause the dream machines man has built will conquer.
Like a storm that rips out thunder from the sky, I call upon you and you know the reason why, because nothing's impossible. Give me the power to see things differently, the power to sell eternity, the power